Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, leaders from Britain, France, and the U.S. are answering questions to their own legislators over airstrikes against Syria over the weekend. What's the consequence of the attack on Syria without UN approval? China's top diplomat meets with Japanese Prime Minister and Foreign Minister in Tokyo. Could better economic ties between the world's second and third largest economies offset rising U.S. tariffs? This is World Insight, and I'm Tian Wei. We start with the airstrike on Syria over the weekend. Last Saturday, the U.S., France, and the U.K. fired 105 missiles overnight targeting Syria's chemical weapons program, so-called, claiming that the Assad government was behind a deadly toxic gas attack in the Syrian town of Douma a week ago. And now the three leaders are facing criticism, at least questions coming from their own lawmakers. They have to justify their authority to launch military actions that bypassed the legislators' approval.
Cold War allies Britain, France and the US insisted they were right in carrying out a joint military action in Syria without seeking parliamentary or congressional approval.
We agreed that it was both right and legal to take military action, together with our closest allies, to alleviate further humanitarian suffering by degrading the Syrian regime's chemical weapons capability.
What we have done is to intervene in a legitimate manner in a multilateral framework.
The purpose of our actions tonight is to establish a strong deterrent against the production, spread, and use of chemical weapons. Establishing this deterrent is a vital national security interest of the United States.
While the three have been triumphing over the result of what they called a perfectly executed strike, it was met with disapproval from other UN Security Council members. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said on Saturday that the US-led strikes on Syria were unacceptable and lawless. A Russian bid for the UN Security Council to condemn the airstrikes failed on Saturday. Only China and Bolivia joined Russia to vote in favor of a draft resolution. On Sunday, a US Senate from the Intelligence Committee told media that so far the Trump administration has not presented any definitive evidence of what chemical weapons had been used in Syria. Back in 2003, U.S. troops invaded Iraq and overthrew the Saddam Hussein government, claiming to rid Iraq of weapons of mass destruction. Yet no evidence of any WMD has been discovered. While declaring victory over the airstrike, Mr. Trump scored Iran and Russia for supporting the Assad government. At the ongoing Arab League summit in Syria, members have called for an international probe into the use of chemical weapons. The Chinese Foreign Ministry says the strike violated the basic principles of international law that prohibit the use of force and violated the UN Charter. China calls for a full, objective and fair investigation into the suspected chemical weapon incident.
For more on the airstrike in Syria, we are joined in our Beijing studio, Teng Jianqun, Director of the Center for Arms Control of the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome, sir. In Moscow, we are joined by Pavel Felgenhauer, Russian defense analyst. In Washington, D.C., we have William Courtney, a former U.S. ambassador and adjunct senior fellow at the RAND Corporation. And also in Washington, we have Jamal Khashoggi, who is a global opinion columnist at the Washington Post. I want to welcome to the four of you, gentlemen. We have a very strong panel, and I want to begin with you, Mr. Felgenhauer, very briefly. Now, here is the discussion about whether so-called international inspectors could come into the site of Douma. Russia said it needs so-called a UN approval. Do you think that should be the reason behind the fact that these investigators have not yet had the access into the site?
Well, yes, there's some problems there in that town of Douma, and actually just today there are some reports that there's been still some clashes. Before it was announced that the town was totally under the control of Russian and Syrian government forces, but now there are reports of some shooting incidents there, which means that it's not totally safe for the UN inspectors. So most likely they will not be appearing there immediately.
These inspectors are, according to media reports, coming from the Organization to Prevent Chemical Weapons, OPCW. Mr. Courtney, at this point, how much do you think investigation can be done, and who should have that role in order to find out whether chemical weapons are being used or not in the town of Douma?
It is the role of the organization that implements the Chemical Weapons Convention. Those are the right inspectors there, but it appears that Russia and Syrian forces on the ground are preventing them from having access to the site, which is raising suspicions in the West that that site is being cleaned up from chemical weapons use.
But at the same time, Mr. Khashoggi, we have seen earlier incidents in which it is not clear which side used the chemical weapons, if chemical weapons were used. This time, U.S. and some of its allies have claimed it has evidence, yet those evidence, quote, has not been shown to the public. So how much shall we believe the sayings and also the rhetoric coming from both sides?
No, repeatedly, the Syrian regime and its allies have used chemical weapons, and as early as 2013, and we remember the deal that President Obama struck with the Russians over the chemical weapons. So there was no doubt about the regime using chemical weapons, and there was never been a proof that the opposition, the Syrian people, used chemical weapons. But repeat, now the world is talking about the almost routine use of the chlorine. Not like the world react to the use of the sarin, but the chlorine to be used in the battlefront by the Syrian regime and its allies is something very common. It's not the first time.
Okay, got your point. You're coming originally from Saudi Arabia. Here, I just want to give a background for our audience. By the way, Mr. Falkenhauer, your foreign minister, in its interview with the media, suggesting that what the media have suggested, including what Mr. Khashoggi just earlier suggested, are mainly so-called accusations coming from the West, and also the media's quotes coming from social media platforms, not necessarily hard evidence whether chemical weapons are being used or not. Mr. Falkenhauer, what do you make of this kinds of explanation?
Well, that has been the Russian position for quite some long time, fully in solidarity with the Assad government in Damascus, which Russia believes is the legitimate government in Syria, that there was no use, that the Assad government didn't use any weapons ever, and that if there were some weapons, they were all destroyed together by Russia and the United States, and that this is all kind of provocations organized by either the Syrian opposition or foreign powers. There was actually officials in Moscow saying it was the British who organized that incident in the Douma. So that has been the position. It's been a full pushback.
All right. The airstrikes on Syria have drawn mixed reactions from world leaders. So take a look at this. Many countries express objections. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani, of course, coming from a very different perspective, warned that the U.S.-led attack would result in, quote, further destruction of the region. Cuba said, of course, also coming from a very different perspective, it was a violation of the UN Charter. Algeria also criticized the airstrikes. Some countries, however, expressed their support. Israel, quote, fully supports Trump's decision. Germany and Canada said the military strikes were necessary and appropriate, end of quote. We see very different positions coming from the UN members. Coming to you, Mr. Tong, of course, China as a Security Council P5 has a lot to say in the decision-making process, but it seems that the UN's role is very limited this time.
Yeah, you're right. I think this time the UN Security Council actually has done nothing related to the so-called chemical attack in Syria. I think it's very hard for any organization, for any expert to give a clear-cut investigation in such an attack. According to the historical arrangement, I mean, in 2013, some experts said there were chemical weapons used in that country, and they could not give which size, even government, non-government, or the terrorist group gave such an attack. So I think at this moment, to my understanding, it's not so logical for the government of Syria to use chemical attack against any side in that area, because all the anti-government forces agreed to withdraw from that area, and it should be crazy for the government to use chemical warfare against the anti-government forces.
At this point, we heard so many different sides talking about their perceptions and their theories and so-called their facts. We do not see necessarily any hard evidence being shown, at least to the public, to our knowledge. For now, we need to move on from the debate about whether chemical attacks are being conducted or not, because that will be leaving to the jobs of the investigators if they have the access going to the site. Having said that, though, many wonder, Mr. Courtney, whether this is going to be a renewed so-called Cold War, escalation of oppositions toward one another between Russia and the United States, whether there's a potential of a proxy war between these two countries too. What is your assessment?
The Cold War was a really dangerous time when the Soviet Union and the United States had a nuclear face-off, which was much more dramatic than the situation today. But what we are seeing is that Russia behaving more aggressively abroad, certainly invading Ukraine in 2014, and then most recently using nerve agents to try to assassinate Sergei Skripal close to London, and now the Syrian attack. It's interesting to compare 2013 Syrian attack and this one. In 2013, when the Syrians used nerve agent, the Russians first denied it. Then Obama threatened to carry out a strike. Russia then reversed its position and worked with the United States to eliminate all of the declared chemical weapons stockpile of Syria. So in that case, Russia was a cooperative great power. Today, Russia's reacting in a different way.
All right. Very interesting the way you explain it. Let me go to you, Mr. Felgenhauer. Some people explain it the other way around, that 2017, when there was another attack coming from the United States into Syria, the name of Russia was not necessarily directly mentioned. Yet this time, Mr. Felgenhauer, even from the White House, who has been maintaining quite a cordial relationship with President Putin, has even mentioned the name of President Putin. So it seems there's quite some change going on from the temperature. Mr. Felgenhauer, what is your feeling? Is there going to be any danger from Russia's perspective, escalation of tension between Russia and the United States, even a new Cold War, some say?
Well, there is a confrontation. It's not only in Syria. It's sort of global between Russia and the West. And basically, when we say West in Moscow, we mean the United States and some of its closest allies. And yes, there was big fear just a week ago that the American coming attack on Syria will be a rather wide scale, much more serious than it actually happened, that it could involve the Russian forces there, and that this could escalate into something out of control, into a direct Russia-American military confrontation. And this didn't happen. And that's, of course, very good for everyone. And it's clear that both sides don't want, even both militaries don't want that happening, and we're clearly working to avoid a direct confrontation.
All right.
And most likely they'll do that in the future, but there's no guarantee that each time when there's a heightened tensions goes up in Syria or somewhere else, in the Donbass or somewhere in Korea, that Russian American military will be able to defuse it on their own and avoid an escalation. The threat is right now has reduced, but it's not disappeared.
Mr. Khashoggi, what's about your assessment? I mean, for now, some say the attack by the United States, even from our allies, 105 missiles, that is a show of strength and force, not necessarily going to change the picture on the ground. Meanwhile, Russia did not react militarily against these strikes. That also means a certain kinds of calmness coming from the Russian side, trying not to change the picture either, not to provoke the other side. Mr. Khashoggi, what is your assessment?
There is a slight chance that it could revive an entrance to resolve the Syrian crisis altogether. In his press conference, Secretary Mattis, an hour right after the strike, spoke about resuming Geneva 1 and spoke about and called on civilized nation to stop the civil war in Syria. Many people now in America and elsewhere are beginning to speak about a solution to the Syrian crisis. That mission is not accomplished as President Trump called it, and there is still there is a need to address the whole problem, not only the chemical side of it. 500,000 Syrians were killed not by chemical weapons, they were killed by a daily bombardment of the Syrian regime. Just a simple picture of what is of Douma today show a crime against humanity that hasn't been seen since World War II. So maybe there is a chance to push now between the Russians and the Americans and the international community for a grand solution, a resolution to the Syrian crisis, and I think we should hope for that.
But Mr. Courtney, I mean, at this point, the White House is talking about escalation of even sanctions against Russia as a result of its support to the Syrian government. Do you think there is going to be any temperature for the two sides to, in a way, be able to seek a solution, even to seek a solution to the Syria crisis, in which Russia does have a lot to say because it has a lot on the ground? Meanwhile, the Syria regime, the president is reluctant to go, and even the United States said, Mr. Courtney, I have to say this, that it is possible for the Assad himself to be able to figure out who will be the one to take his place in Syria. So is there any possibility, given the current temperature, of all the sides to come to any kind of solution for the near future?
There is a possibility to begin a credible United Nations-led peace process that involves all the regional countries as well as great powers, Russia, China, Europe, and the United States. This crisis in Syria is so complex and so serious that just a few countries, for example, Russia has been working with Turkey and Iran to try to have some kind of a peace process. This crisis is much too big for that. Among other things, to solve a crisis like Syria requires a huge amount of money for economic reconstruction. Well, only the West has that money. China also has a lot of money, but Russia doesn't. So this requires a much broader United Nations-led peace process. Right now, Russia, Iran, Syria are not committed to that process.
But at the same time, is the United States committed to that process? Mr. Felgenhauer, from the Russian perspective, we see President Trump has been repeatedly investigated by the establishment, and it seems that with the Comey recently, the rhetoric coming from there, he's further in trouble. So people wonder, what are the attack against Syria? Is originally an attack about so-called chemical attacks, which the evidence has not been shown, or is it more domestic politics related? Mr. Felgenhauer, from Russia's perspective, how do you guys see this?
Yes, it was just mentioned that about maybe 500,000 Syrians lost their lives on all sides of this terrible civil war, and very, very few of them, of this number, from chemical weapons per se. So this, what happened in Douma, is not really that important for two great nuclear superpowers to move to the brink of a open military confrontation. There are other reasons, and these reasons are not really so much in Syria. Washington is split, the establishment there is split and infighting. And there are splits in the establishment in Moscow too. There's a party of war and a party of peace. So this is more internal from a Russian point of view and from the American point of view. And there are those who maybe believe that some are keeping the confrontation alive, keeping it hot, though of course no one really wants war. Even the party of war in Moscow doesn't want war with America, no way. But keeping the confrontation live is very important for many internal reasons. So this is a very complicated situation. It's not just about Syria, it's not just about the Geneva process and finding a way to kind of put Syria back again together.
We all agree.
Possible.
We all agree. There are so many different layers. There are so many different layers of things that's related to the current situation in Syria, and even this attack and no counterattack, so-called. Let me go to you, Mr. Tong, as well. If you look at what is going on between Russia and the United States, President Trump, just a few weeks ago, saying to President Putin, come to the White House, let's have a meeting, okay? And now the tone has changed. So which one is more likely to be the future trend of this bilateral relationship? The quote-unquote invitation, or now further sanctions? Is Syria the issue, or Syria is only a reflection of the overall relationship between these two countries?
Of course, the competition in Syria has been a reflection of the relations between the two superpowers, or two major powers in the world. Actually, if we look at the relations between Russia and the United States, we can discuss from two layers. The first is the personal relations. I'm sure President Donald Trump would like to have such a summit, in the future. And as he said, after the re-election of Putin as the president of Russia, and this is a personal relation. I'm sure Putin would like to have such a summit. And another layer is state to state, especially the representatives and the senators in the Capitol Hill. They would like to have some enemy of the United States, so they can have benefit some from the competition between the two major powers. This is actually a state-to-state relations, and I don't think Donald Trump has much room to go forward to improve the relation between the two countries.
All right. Well, we have different perspectives certainly in this discussion. Before we go, I do want to have very briefly your opinions, Mr. Courtney, for example. Will there be another strike? If there were going to be, what is likely to be the scale of that strike? What is your assessment, sir?
At present, it's impossible to predict whether there will be another strike. If the Syrian government were to use chemical weapons again on a large scale, then one could not rule out that European countries, the United States, might get together again to try to raise the cost to Assad of using chemical weapons through a strike or some other mechanism.
All right. Mr. Felgenhauer, from the Russian side, what do you think? Briefly.
Well, there's hope that there will be no more, that this is a one-time act. But of course, Russia is going to be very seriously talking about that the United States and its allies violated international law, that this is absolutely unacceptable, and this will make relations even worse than they were before.
All right. We want to thank the four of you, gentlemen, for being with us. Of course, you have different opinions, but that is perfectly okay in an incident like this. Pavel Felgenhauer and Teng Jianqun, William Courtney, Jamal Khashoggi. Thank you so much for being with us, gentlemen.